In our post-Champlain Tower South world, how have our reserve study recommendations changed? As you can imagine, we're recommending more reserve funding. But why? And how have some of the long-standing metrics changed? What can you learn from this new data to keep your association safe, provide the cash you need while avoiding special assessments, and maximize your property values? Keep watching to find out.
And that gets me to a time where I need to turn the microphone over to Wayne, who's going to spend a few minutes talking about what the numbers actually say about the reserve studies we've been preparing for our clients since 2021. And think about this. As Wayne speaks, I wonder if your experience is going to resonate with what Wayne begins to share with you. Wayne.
Hey, thanks, Robert. I'm glad to be here with you and our audience today. Yeah, I'm going to spend a few minutes with you to show you what's been normal and what we've seen in the data that we've collected after the Champlain Tower South collapse. The image you see here on the screen shows what our normal reserve funding recommendations have been through the years as a percentage of total budget. It's easy to see commonly what we find an association needs to set aside towards reserve to sustain the association is about 25% of their total budget. Right there, that middle tall bar. Some types of associations can get by with less, and some need a little more. But this generally reflects the amount of common areas the associations are responsible for and the different materials that they're made out of. And it also takes into consideration like local wear and tear due to weathering at the association. Some associations have harsh alpine environments, others are in saltwater beach environments. So the chart is pretty stable ever since we started collecting this data. The next chart shows the same information, but just since now January 1st of 2022, when associations began adopting their first budget since the Champlain Tower South collapse. So what do you notice here? The peak is still at 25%, but there are so many associations needing to set aside more than 25% of their budget. We call this having a high right shoulder, as the graphic clearly shows there. It also shows that in the last 2 years, many more associations than normal have needed to set aside more than the 25%, possibly a lot more than 25% of their budget towards their reserves. You're probably asking yourself, well, what's going on? Well, there are two reasons we feel that explain this behavior. The first one is that we have so many new clients reaching out to us since Champlain Tower South fell. So many associations that hadn't been doing reserve planning in a long while. Remember Robert's recommendation a few moments ago that the best practice is to update your reserve study at least every third year with an on-site visit. But what we're seeing is a wave of associations influencing the data that hadn't been responsibly funding their reserves and had gotten way behind on their reserve funding. And we are now in a significant catch-up mode. Remember that Mother Nature and Father Time don't care if your budget is tight. They're not going to wait to wear out your roof, paint, or asphalt. They're doing that every single day. But the good news is that the associations finally reached out for advice. The bad news is what we delivered to them. They were far behind, and they had to start setting aside more reserves than normal to prepare for their upcoming projects. The other reason is what Robert said about adding additional projects to reserves. These are things like major maintenance and inspections that likely you were grumbling about and funding them from trade-offs in your operating budget. But now they are legitimate scheduled reserve projects. Rather than being big old budget busters, they're now just scheduled expenses the association needs to prepare to pay. So it's not making life more expensive at your association. It's just finally get that these projects are appearing as line items in your budget. So on the next slide here, the takeaway lesson for this is in a stable situation, most associations should be setting aside something in the range of 25% of their budget towards reserves. Some associations that got behind need to set aside more, but 25% is an easy number to remember. What's interesting is that this number is pretty stable when we slice it down further into condos versus townhomes versus high-rises versus homeowners associations versus large versus small, new and old. This 25% budget going to reserves is a pretty stable and useful figure. Okay, new subject. Here's a profile of the reserve fund strength of associations all across the country. Information that we compiled over the last 30 years. So what you see is the percent of associations on the left in the red, that's the weak range, the percent of association in the middle, which is in the fair range in the yellow, and the percent of associations in green on the right side, that's the strong range. This shows you the profile of associations across the country and how well equipped their reserves are to handle upcoming expenses. Now, this slide shows a profile of our Florida association clients. Note there are so many more associations in the red weak range, and this is why the deadly Champlain Tower South collapse happened in Florida and not in other similar states. This is because in Florida, the law has historically allowed homeowners a line item veto on reserve funding. And in many associations, the homeowners regularly vetoed reserve funding, with the result of that a disproportionate amount of Florida associations didn't have much cash in reserves, which meant they either didn't do the repairs or replacements on their buildings in a timely manner, or they went from one special assessment to another. This is not a recent change. I just wanted to give you some perspective, though. Many people think that this is a profile of reserve funding strength across the country, and they're very wrong. This is only the case in Florida. So let's go back to that historical national profile. Now I'm showing you the percentages of associations in each category. If you notice, 26% of associations have a strong reserve fund. And if you add that 26% of strong associations to the 40% that are in the fair category, that means 66% or 2/3 of associations are doing either fair or pretty good with respect to funding their reserves. It's only the associations in the red zones that are making all the bad news and giving associations and their boards a bad reputation. Now here's a recent profile of Champlain Tower South. Note the percent of associations in the poor red zone jumped from 34% up to 42%. So recently, more associations are falling in the red poor zone, meaning they don't have enough reserves on hand to take care of the necessary projects at their association. And this is really unfortunate. So again, we ask the question, why is this happening? And we feel the primary answer is the same. Lots of new clients coming to us reaching out for help. And for the same reason, we're recommending catch-up size reserve transfers. It's because they've been slipping for years due to underfunding their reserves. And we also feel that a factor is that we're recommending more projects to be included in the reserves that were previously only being deferred or were being budget busters in the operating budget. But we believe that's a secondary effect. So the lesson to learn is that there are still plenty of associations in the fair or strong range. I sound like a broken record always saying, take care of your property and fund your reserves so that the money is there when you need it. So now here's our third topic for today, where I can show you the correlation between percent funded, which measures the reserve fund strength, and special assessments. To no one's surprise, when the association doesn't have much money, on the left side of the chart, the 0 to 30% red zone, special assessments are pretty common. Roughly 50% of those associations need a special assessment to take care of major products at their associations. And notice on the right side of the chart, all the associations at or above the 70% funded, how special assessments are rare. And no surprise, when an association has been responsible setting aside reserves to offset deterioration, projects get done on time without special assessments. Here's the same information, but for just the last 2 years since Champlain Towers. It's the same profile, no real change here. In fact, why don't you flip back to that other slide, Robert, so people can see the difference that nothing really has changed.
Not much change. So this is historical, and then this is now just the last 2 years.
Right. And that's because the relationship between not having money and needing a special assessment hasn't really changed. Anytime an association doesn't have enough money to take care of itself, we need to recommend a special assessment. And that's unsettling and disruptive to the homeowners. It delays a project getting done, and it forces the unlucky set of homeowners at the time of the expense to pay the entire cost of a project. Remember that deterioration occurs gradually over the years. It's very predictable. This chart shows us that special assessments are a preventable problem. So the takeaway from this data is pretty simple. It's now, and it always has been, a good idea for the reserves at your association to be at or above 75% funded. That's when you enjoy smooth budgeting with projects getting done on time. Because there are real consequences for not having money and the asphalt being full of potholes or the roof leaking. Property values suffer and homeowners get hit with unfair and unwanted special assessments. And remember, these are special assessments for things that deteriorated in plain sight over the course of many years. It really takes a stubborn board to ignore the obvious and let the association fall into decay because of not doing their job to collect the funds from the homeowners that are necessary to sustain the association. Thanks, Robert.
Yeah, well, thank you, Wayne. A great job of digging into that data and making the story pretty clear without having to look at a whole lot of numbers. It's nice to see what did change and also what didn't change, like the last point where it does indeed make perfect sense that when you run out of money to do what needs to get done or you don't have the money, it puts the association into a special assessment situation. There's that strong relationship, and that has nothing to do with pre-Champlain Tower South or after Champlain Tower South. There's that whole idea that deterioration is predictable and you can put the money into reserves and plan to avoid special assessments. That's kind of neat.
At Association Reserves, we make the present less stressful and the future more secure. If you want to join us in this mission, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment down below on what you'd like to see us address in a future video. Let's plan for your best future.